there, this is Ross Izzard, and this is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places. I had hoped to have a really cool guest interview with you today with one of the more famous guides on the South Platte here in Colorado, but we have not been able to make the timing work yet. He's pretty busy running around trade shows and all that stuff. I'm pretty busy because it's legislative season and my life is getting very hectic. And so, unfortunately for you, instead of that interview, you're just going to talk to me about my winter fly box. I got a whole bunch of comments about fly patterns and a number of other things on an Instagram post that I put up just a few weeks ago. Seems like there are a lot of people out there who are interested in which patterns they ought to be fishing. And so I thought that this would be a cool opportunity to dive into that a little bit. I've actually got my nymph box open in front of me on the desk here. And we're going to talk about it. But it also provides a way for us to talk about fly tying. If you don't tie your own flies, it's okay. You don't have to. I didn't tie my own for the first several years that I fly fished. It just made more sense to buy them. I didn't know what I was doing. You have plenty to worry about when it comes to learning how to fish without having to stress about how the hell you're supposed to tie a fly. And it requires a whole bunch of other stuff and practice and learning and yada, 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 yada. It's a lot if you're trying to learn how to fish. So if you buy your own flies, it's cool. No judgment. But if you really want to have the maximum fly fishing experience, you want to tie. You want to tie your own flies for a couple of reasons. The first being that, honestly, tying your own flies is almost as fun as fishing a lot of the time. When I have a really bad day or I'm really stressed out, I want to sit at my desk and I want to sit at my vise and I just want to take a bunch of feathers and fur and dubbings and glitter and shiny shit and make cool looking bugs on hooks. It's kind of a weird hobby. Telling people that you tie fake insects onto hooks so that you can throw them at fish probably is not going to make you the most popular person in the dating scene or the next party you're at. But who cares? It's fun to do. It's awesome therapy. It's the kind of activity that is sort of consciously unconscious. It's like driving. Requires enough focus and attention on your part that it keeps you occupied and it's mentally stimulating and it's fun to learn new patterns and the motions are fun. But it's not so heavy and so labor intensive and so just demanding of your concentration that you can't do it while having a conversation or listening to a podcast or listening to music, which is my favorite thing to do, or just thinking about life, because life's complicated. And sometimes it's nice to just sit quietly, think about something, work your way through it in your mind, but have your hands busy and keep yourself occupied. That's when I do my best thinking. I don't know when you do your best thinking, but if you are not tying your own flies, you really ought to be, because it'll really enhance the game. And then you have this additional bonus from it, which is that it gives you something to do over the winter. You might not be able to fish all the time. The weather sucks. You could have an Arctic blast like we're supposed to have this week. Maybe you're just too busy with work or for whatever reason, you can't get out to the water. Fly tying is a way to stay connected to the sport, keep your head in the game, really stay connected to the water, even if you have to take a few weeks off and just be inside where it's warm or whatever, for whatever reason. And then when you go out, you get to catch fish on your own flies, which, man, the first time you catch a fish on your own fly, and I guarantee you it's going to be a shitty fly because that's just the way that it goes. Nobody ties good flies their first time. I still remember the first fly that I caught a fish on the first cast with it, and it was the world's worst pheasant tail. I threw it in behind a rock, and I caught like a 7-inch rainbow trout. And it changed my life because it's so cool to catch a fish on a fly that you tied yourself and know that you sort of saw that creative process all the way through the materials and the tying to the actual catching of the fish. It's a pretty incredible experience, and once you do it, you're going to be ruined forever. You're never going to be back. You're never going to be able to go back to not tying your own flies. Store-boughts are fine, but once you learn how to tie and once you start catching fish on those, you're going to start getting weird in particular about how you tie these things, and then you're going to be stuck and the mental illness is going to get worse. So, sorry, not sorry. You're going to love it, and it's a pretty awesome way to spend some winter time if you need something to do that keeps you fly fishing, even if it's only in your own head. Now, I put a post up on Instagram not too long ago that showed a number of my porterhouse steak patterns. So these are the real big, juicy flies that are typically in the point position for me when I am nymphing in the wintertime. They're big and juicy because my theory is that fish are not going to move very far in general. Water's cold, they're tired, lethargic, not super hungry. They might not move for the chicken nugget fly, that little size 22 zebra midge you've got, but they might get up and move for one of those big porterhouse flies, like a rubber legs or something else. So I posted that on Instagram, got a bunch of traction, and then got a bunch of messages from people who said things like, what pattern is that? Where can I buy them? Which pattern should I be fishing in the winter? Yada, 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 yada. And I will preface the discussion today by saying the pattern that you fish in the wintertime is important for sure. And I'll tell a story about that here in just a second. But it's probably not the most important thing. I think some guys get really hung up on patterns and they believe that it's, it has to be a number 20 orange, this thing with gold ribbing and this color hair. Maybe. Every now and then you run across fish that are that selective. In general, though, that's just not the case. The pattern matters. Obviously, insect life matters. You want to try to match the hatch-ish, I guess. But you don't need to get so hung up in patterns that you're changing flies every 10 minutes. And if you're doing that, you're probably doing it wrong. There's something else going on. So don't get too hung up on these. But do understand that pattern does matter. So I went fishing today on one of my, I hate to say it's one of my favorite tailwaters because it kind of isn't. But it's one of the best winter fisheries in the state of Colorado. For a long time, it was a best kept secret, and nobody really knew about it because nobody talked about it. And then people started talking about it, posting it online, and now it has been spot burned to the point that, I went out today. It's a Wednesday as I record this. It was 10 degrees when I started fishing. It was 34 degrees when I stopped fishing, and I probably saw like 25 guys out on this stretch of river. It was a lot. One of those guys was a guide, and he was out there with a couple of clients, and they were fishing. And I stopped at one point to kind of chat with him to make sure I wasn't going to high-hole him or get in his way, and he was appreciative of that. We made a plan, yada, yada. Nice guy. He was watching me fish, saw me catch a couple, and it was pretty obvious that his clients were not catching fish, which if you're a fly fishing guide is not great news for your pocketbook. So he stumbled his way over to me and said, hey, man, I don't usually do this, but I just saw you pull a couple nice ones out of there. Which fly are you using? And I, usually I get a little defensive about this, right? Like I sort of don't like telling people what they're biting on, air quotes, unless they ask real nicely because, it's not that complicated and you can probably figure it out. But in this case, the guy was super duper nice. And so rather than being a complete asshole, and when he said, what are they biting on, saying the flies or something like that, I told him what I was using, which in this case was a number 10 cranefly larva, followed by a number 18 prince nymph, followed by a number 22 zebra midge. Yes, I had 3 flies on today. It's one of those rare instances where I will throw 3 in a nymphing trio, and it was working pretty damn well, actually, for most of the morning. He said he hadn't heard of a couple of the patterns that I had on, in particular the cranefly pattern, so I gave him a couple of them. He went back over to his clients, and when I walked off, they were tying these things on, and they were getting back to fishing. When I came back later that afternoon, I passed them again, and as I was walking by the clients, one of them hooked into this amazing rainbow, probably like an 18 or 19-inch fish. And he was just the happiest guy in the world. I mean, he was smiling ear to ear. He was thrilled. He was just over the moon about this fish, and the guide was smiling, and it was cool. It was cool to know that, putting on the right pattern really made a difference for them, and I was glad that I could help. But that said, sometimes there's not a right pattern. Sometimes sometimes it doesn't matter. They'll eat whatever. Sometimes you don't have the right pattern. Sometimes they don't want to eat anything. Stuff happens. So yeah, it matters. Sometimes it matters more than others. Just don't get too hung up on these, right? And also understand that the patterns that I have in my box are uniquely mine, right? So they have names, obviously, that will be familiar to you. But I usually tie them a little bit differently. The more that you tie flies, the more you start to realize what you like or don't like about various patterns. and you'll start to modify them. Maybe it's to make it quicker. Maybe it's to use fewer materials. Maybe it's to make them heavier so they sink faster. Maybe it's just because you like a certain color, whatever. And so, it's going to be different for everybody. And that's part of why I don't mind telling you, because the truth is you can go buy these patterns somewhere, but the ones you buy are never going to look exactly like the ones that I tie. And the ones that you tie are never going to look like the ones that I tie. They might be similar, but we're not out there throwing identical patterns. And that's kind of a cool thing about fly fishing and any creative endeavor. But it also means that I'm not super duper worried that you're going to go out there and catch all of my fish. So, without further ado, I've got the box in front of me here, and we're just going to go through this. So this is a fish pond something or other fly box. It's one of those magnetic closure boxes that has fly slots with the tacky gummy stuff. I forget the name of it off the top of my head. And it holds 336 flies. So, that's a lot of flies, but you can never have too many flies because they don't weigh very much. And the whole thing is full. I actually just recently got done refilling it, and that was fun. It was cool to get it done and satisfying to get that done. But there are rows of 12, so every row, for the most part, is its own pattern. I have a few really special patterns to me that are that have 2 rows, just because I'm neurotic, and sometimes I feel like I have to have 24 of a fly pattern, which is definitely not true, but hey, here we are. But you really gotta earn a slot. You gotta earn a row in my box, right? So this is the only nymph box I carry. I carry a nymph box, I carry a dry fly box, and I carry a streamer box. That's it. I don't carry multiple nymph boxes. I don't have a midge box. I don't have a, Baetis box. I don't have a mayfly box. I just have those 3 boxes in my pack all the time. And that means that they're usually full, and that means I'm real selective about which patterns find their way in there. Partially because I don't want to tie flies that don't work, and partially because if you're going to be in my box, you're going to have to work, girl. You gotta get out there and perform. So these have all been curated. I tie them because they fish well, and they fish well because they catch fish. So I feel very confident in it. I feel like I could pack this box up and take it with me anywhere in the world where there are trout, and I bet you I'm going to put some fish in the net, assuming that there are fish in the water. So real confident in it. I take it everywhere I go. I love it. And I hope that one day you have a fly box that you are as irrationally attached to as I am to mine. And it also has my name, my phone number, and a little sticker on it that says that I will give you $500 if you bring it back to me if I ever drop it in the river somewhere, because it constitutes many, many, many hours of my life that I would hate to lose. So we've got flies on both sides of the box. I'm not going to hit every single pattern because you'll probably get bored before the end, but I am going to run through them here and give you some thoughts. You probably have a lot of these in your box. If you don't, that's cool. You can build it however you want, but this is what I've got. So let's start from the top. At the top, I have Beadhead Pat's rubber legs. We've talked about these before. It's a stonefly imitation. They are made with little rubber legs, as the name might imply, and then they're tied with chenille bodies. Mine are tied with black chenille, or sort of a olive camo-ish chenille. I forget the exact name of the color. And I tie them with bead heads. So the black ones get black bead heads. The other ones get gold bead heads, or sometimes brass, depending on what I'm using. But they are incredibly effective. They're heavy. I tie them with lead wire wraps to make sure that they are extra heavy and they can sink fast. And they drag the whole rig down to the bottom, and they very often get eaten. Stoneflies are down on the bottom of the river, for a year or 2 years at a time before they hatch. Which means even in the dead of winter, this fly is a top performer for me. I never have fewer than a dozen of these in my box ever. And if you were looking for an awesome go-to point fly, you're going to struggle to do better than the rubber legs in the winter months. Below that, I've got my worm patterns, my San Juan worm patterns. There are a few different variations of these. Red worms, brown worms, the worms that have beads in the middle of them, worms that don't. But they're there. I don't fish these super duper often. Partially because, even though this is stupid, I consider them to be sort of junk flies, and I don't love fishing them. I like the prettier ones better. That's no shade on you guys if you fish squirmy wormies or San Juans. They work. So, do what you got to do to put a fish in the net. These don't get used super often, but they're in the box anyway. And occasionally I will break them out, especially if nothing else is working, and they very often will be effective at getting something going. Directly below those is a new pattern that I have more recently started tying, and it is called the Schaefer's Gummy Crane. These are really, really gross. They're tied with sort of rubberized, squirmy, wormy material, and you tie them up by wrapping that around the hook shank all the way up to the top. You put a little sort of brown larva head on this thing, and then you have some nymph skin or some thin skin that you put over the top, which gives it sort of this cool, realistic, two-toned color that once you put a little bit of ribbing on there in the form of, in this case, extra small copper wire ribbing, these things fish like crazy. They are not fun to tie, I'm not going to lie to you. That squirmy, wormy material is really, really slippery, and I had to tie, probably a dozen of these before I finally figured out the right amount of tension to use and how to do this thing without that material slipping everywhere or just generally having kind of a bad time. But once you get the hang of it, these things fish like crazy. So crane fly larvae, if you've ever seen them, are big. They're really big. These are size 10s, like I said. They get bigger than that. I don't know that I would necessarily tie these bigger than that, but they do get bigger than that. And even though fish don't spend a lot of time eating crane flies, adult crane flies with the big long legs that you see on the water, they do eat crane fly larvae, and kind of like stoneflies, those crane fly larvae are down there pretty much all the time. Fairly long life cycle. The larvae are down there a lot. They're big. They're recognizable to trout, and they constitute a pretty juicy steak dinner. A lot of calories in there, which means that they fish great. These very often find their way into my rig these days, sometimes instead of the Pat's rubber legs, which is really high praise because I like those Pat's rubber legs. But they've been great. And even though they're annoying to tie, I think you should have them in your box. And they come with the added benefit of the fact that very few fly fishermen ever talk about or fish crane fly larvae of any kind, because we just don't talk about crane flies. We talk about mayflies, and we talk about caddis flies, and we talk about midges and other stuff. But you just don't hear a lot of guys talk about crane flies. And that's interesting because they fish great. On top of being super gross, they're really realistic looking patterns. You can gross out your wife or your girlfriend or your kids, and they're fun. They look like actual worms, and man, if you wanna catch a fish, these guys will get you a big one in a lot of rivers. Below that, I've got the perdigons. I hate perdigons. I don't like European nymphing or tightline nymphing of any kind. The casting just sort of makes me sad. It's possible that that's just because I'm bad at it, but, I just don't think it's super fun. That said, if you're going to ever do tightline nymphing, and I do occasionally do tightline nymphing, you're going to want some perdigons in your box. And even if you're just fishing with an indicator, if you really need to get it down quick, if you need to sink these things to the bottom as fast as possible, perdigon is going to do that for you. These are tied in a variety of sizes. I do them anywhere from about a size 14 down to a size 10. Every now and then I'll tie a smaller one like a 16, but they're usually about that size because I like to put some lead wire wraps on them to give them a ton of extra weight. And then I like to put a larger than necessary bead head on them. For some reason, this pattern just looks better with the big bead head on it. Once they're finished, you coat them with some UV resin to make sure that you smooth out all the rough places. And basically what you make is a torpedo, right? So these things get thrown into the water. They sink down immediately. That bead head drags them down. And because you have smoothed out the body with that nice taper and then that UV resin, there's like no water resistance on them at all. No friction. They just go straight to the bottom. So if you ever need to get down quick and you're looking for a point fly that's really going to get you down there in a hurry without split shot, you're probably not going to do better than perdigons. You can tie them in any color you want. I currently have some olive ones, a couple of blue and purple ones, a couple of orange and brown ones, and then a number of kind of rainbow colored ones that sort of look like a crazy rainbow warrior type fly. And they fish okay. I don't catch a ton of fish on perdigons. I find that I catch most of my fish in those rigs on the trailer flies. But the perdigons are good. And they're something that you should have in your box, especially if you're going to be fishing faster water, or if you really feel the need to go out and do that Euro nymphing thing. To each their own. Next up, and this is one of the few patterns that I've got that actually has earned 2 slots in my fly box, 2 rows in my fly box, and that is the Chocolate Thunder. It's basically a foam back emerger. So it's a little tiny emerger that has a trailing shuck on it. It kind of looks like a pheasant tail, but the big difference is that it has a wing made of white foam. I tie these from 18s all the way down to 22s. I don't tie them much smaller than that or bigger than that. They look just like an emerging insect. That foam wing kind of gives them an interesting buoyancy profile underwater, so I think they sort of float nicely in the drift. But they also look like an insect that is popping its wings out of the wing casing and shooting up to the surface, and they fish great. I have a number of different kinds of these. Some of them have bead heads if I just want to have it get down quick. I do have a whole row of unweighted versions of them so that I can use them as a trailer fly behind a larger, heavier fly and still let them get that kind of natural drift off the bend. But these get fished quite a bit, and they're pretty good in the winter. When you start seeing midge hatches coming off, or any kind of insect activity, really, you can get away with fishing these foam back emergers for most of the day, and they do pretty well, even in the winter months. These get pulled out quite often. Next up is the RS2. You probably already know about RS2s. It is like the craziest, most versatile fly ever. You can fish it as a dry fly. You can fish it as an emerger. You can fish it as a nymph. It doesn't super duper look like anything in particular, but it has a couple of tails and it has a CDC wing that gives it this kind of nice floaty pop. And they fish great. RS2s are good. I candidly don't throw these as often as I probably should. They just don't pop to my mind as one of my main confidence patterns. But they're awesome, and people swear by them. They do catch fish. They're not super difficult to tie as long as you are willing to, not go cross-eyed by trying to tie on those 2 little strands of hair as the mayfly tails. But they're great, and I have a full row of those, and they are a really good addition to the winter box. Below those, pheasant tails. If you guys don't have pheasant tails in your box, you're doing it wrong, straight up. If you don't have beadhead pheasant tails somewhere in your fly box for the winter and every other month of the year, you are going to have trouble, because pheasant tails are very arguably in the top 3 fly patterns ever invented as far as how well they work when it comes to catching fish. They're a little difficult to tie depending on which version you do. I do a version called the American pheasant tail that I have kind of modified over the course of time to fit my needs. There are other types of pheasant tails, but really the, sort of unifying factor is that they are tied with, and I know this is going to shock you, but with pheasant tails and fibers from a pheasant tail, and then used to imitate whatever. They kind of look like mayfly nymphs. They kind of look like caddis nymphs. They kind of look like some other type of buggy thing in the water. And they work great. So I tie them in bead heads most of the time. This row has them ranging from about an 18 down to around a 20. I might have a 22 in there somewhere. But they do great, and I usually tie them with some kind of a hotspot collar. So it might be orange, might be red. But for whatever reason, I believe that the flies do better when you tie them with a collar in this particular pattern. I can't prove it. You can believe me or not believe me. I don't care. That's how I do it. And pheasant tails are on my line pretty frequently in all seasons of the year. Below that, another standby pattern. That is the hare's ear. Same thing. Hare's ears they could imitate anything that you want, really. You can tie them real big to kind of look like a stonefly. You can tie them real small to look like a midge. You could tie them in the mid-range to look like a mayfly or caddisfly larva. You can tie them with flash. You can tie them without flash, whatever. These things work. I don't know what they look like. I don't think the fish know what they look like, but they look like bugs. And they get eaten pretty often, and they come with the added benefit of being ridiculously easy to tie, right? So depending on how you do your hare's ear, and I'm sure you could make it more complicated than how I tie mine, but the only materials on it are thread, dubbing, and wire wraps, plus a bead for the bead head. And that's basically it. I mean, it's literally a bunch of dubbing and wire wrapped around a hook with a little tiny pheasant tail or mallard flank feather tail behind it or shuck behind it. And they take no time at all. I could probably tie a dozen of these in, 10 minutes, maybe. Maybe a little bit longer than 10 minutes. I'm not quite that fast, but they do great. They're super simple to tie. they're kind of one of those versatile patterns that, you can try to match the hatch if you want to, but they just kind of work everywhere because they look like everything. So hare's ears, good stuff. Rolling on through here, on the next side of the box, we have the caddis section. So I have a few different caddis patterns here. One of them is just a very generic caddis larva pattern. It's got sort of a brown collar on it. It has a little bit of a trailing shuck and legs. And then I tie it usually with ostrich hurl to sort of make the legs of the larva come alive underwater. Tie these from 16s on down to 20s, and they do pretty well. These fish pretty well. They don't do amazingly in the wintertime. I think they do better in the warmer months just because of how caddis flies operate. But they do work in the wintertime, and they're very often on there if I need something other than one of the other patterns. So standard caddisfly larva. Then I have the electric caddis larva, which is kind of the same concept, but now tied with small or ultra small, ultra wire, threaded through teeny tiny tubing to make this kind of really cool segmented body. These don't fish amazingly, if I'm being honest. I don't tie them on very often, so maybe I just haven't given them a fair shake. But they're awful fun to tie, and they're really cool looking. If you get a chance, look up electric caddis, and you'll see what I mean. They're just really cool looking flies. They're fun to tie. I have caught fish on them. I just don't tie them on super often. And for that reason, even though they're not the most effective fly in my box, they get a row to themselves. And then above that is my own pattern, which I call the Nuka pupa. And it's a caddis pupa pattern. I'm not going to tell you how to tie these because I invented it. And I don't want to share the recipe unless you want to send me a whole bunch of money. And even then, I'll probably say no. But suffice it to say that it is sort of a weird cross between a pheasant tail and a traditional caddis larva. It's designed to look like a caddis emerger. It does not necessarily fish like an emerger, and it works better in the wintertime than it probably should. It actually doesn't really make a lot of sense for caddis emerger patterns to be working well in the wintertime most of the time. But it does. It catches fish. And so I keep tying it on. It's fun to tie. It's sort of crazy looking, and it's enjoyable. So it rounds out Caddis Corner in my box. Then I've got kind of what I consider to be attractor patterns. Okay, so I'll run through these pretty quickly. I have Rainbow Warriors, which are basically, small size midge larva patterns that are tied with iridescent tinsel or pearl tinsel to make them super shiny. Might have red collars on them and a little bit of sort of crystal dubbing on them. And they're fun. There are people here who swear by it. I think we had Patrick Srebniak from Avid Max last season who said that these are the closest thing to a cheat code that you can get in fly fishing. I don't know if I feel quite that strongly about it, but they do work for reasons unbeknownst to us. And if you are having trouble hooking up with fish, sometimes tying on a spandangly Rainbow Warrior or some type of flashy pattern is a good way to kind of get their attention and get them to come over to you. Below that, we've got Batman nymphs. I don't know if you've ever seen these before, but they are stonefly imitations that are sort of modeled off of a prince nymph, which with the goose biots and a number of other features. But then they also have rubber legs on them, and they look like small stonefly larva patterns in most cases. I tie these pretty small. If I want to fish a real big, heavy stonefly pattern, I'm going to use the Pats. These are more for when I want to fish a smaller pattern, and I'm usually tying these in a 16 or an 18. I do have some tied in 20, but they kind of start getting tough to work with those rubber legs at that size. And they're on there fairly frequently, again, both in the winter and in the summer. They do pretty well. Below that is what I believe to be the best fly pattern in the history of all fly patterns, and that is the Prince Nymph. I have caught more fish on Prince Nymphs than I can count, and probably more fish on Prince Nymphs than with every other form of fly in my box combined. No joke. They have white goose biot wings on them, and then they have brown goose biot tails on them. They're usually tied with peacock hurl for the body with some wire wraps around it to hold it together. And then I tie mine with a gold bead and a hotspot collar. And they don't look like anything. They don't look like any type of bug. They don't imitate anything specifically. They're sort of just this ridiculous fly. But they just fish like crazy. I was catching fish on them today. It's January 15th as I record this. It'll go up here in a couple days. Fish are eating it. I fish them in the summer, fish are eating it. I go elsewhere, fish are eating it. Still water, fish are eating it. Small creeks, fish are eating it. Big rivers, fish are eating it. You get my drift. I mean, these things work everywhere. And this is very often my confidence fly. Like if I'm going to tie on a nymph, whether that's in a nymph rig or it's a dry dropper or anything else, it is probably going to be a Prince nymph in most cases because they just plain old work to the point that it does start to feel like cheating. There are days where I make myself fish something other than a Prince nymph because it's just so damn effective. Check them out. They're ridiculous, but man, they really do work in all conditions and all water types pretty much all the time. And as a result, they get 2 full rows in my box, and I have considered giving them a third because I get through a lot of Prince nymphs. And they're not super duper fun to tie because the biots are kind of fiddly. If you have reasonably sized hands, messing with stuff that small can be a challenge. But they're worth it. You know, I fish so much of them that I probably tie 200 Prince nymphs a season. To the point that by the time I get to the end of the season, I feel like I literally cannot tie another Prince nymph ever for the rest of my life. But then I always do because they catch fish. And like, let's be real, if your flies are working and catching you fish, you're probably going to keep tying those. So that's what I do with the Prince nymphs. And then the last little section of the box that I want to talk about is my midge section. This is the depressing part of the box where hopes and dreams of fly fishing being cool go to die. It is where you have microscopic flies that sometimes require forceps to actually work with. And unfortunately is the section where I have to go pretty much all the time in the winter because midges are so damn important to winter trout. On this side, I have a whole bunch of different patterns. So I have Higa's SOS, which is not really a midge pattern, but is maybe it's Higa. I don't know how to say the guy's name. Whatever. You guys can look it up if you want to, but it's sort of a flashy, attractive, midge-y looking pattern that has tinsel legs and a red flashback and a trailing shuck and a number of other things. They're okay. I haven't had an amazing time with them, but they're good enough that they get to keep their slot for now. I have not ruled out the possibility that they could be evicted from the box at some point. But they work okay. Below those, I've got the WD-40s. If you guys don't fish WD-40s, you're crazy. They work amazingly, and they work in ridiculously small sizes. Some of my best fish that I have caught have been on like size 24 WD-40s unweighted. They are really basically just thread on a hook. I mean, they have a little tiny bit of dubbing to kind of round out the thorax. They have a little bit of feathers on them to give them their wing case, and then they have tails on them, usually tied with mallard feathers, for me at least. But otherwise, I mean, they are brain dead simple. You can tie one of these about every 20 seconds. They don't take very long. And they work really, really well, especially in winter water when the fish are looking for midges of any kind. WD-40s are awesome as a trailer fly or a chicken nugget fly in your winter rig. Below that, I've got the Top Secret midge, which is more of a midge emerger pattern. I will sometimes fish those kind of in the middle of the water column in the wintertime. I don't tie these on super duper often. I probably should do more. They do okay. Like, they're kind of in the same boat as the SOS. They are good enough that they haven't gotten a boot yet, but they're not so good that I'm sure they're going to be there forever. So, do what you want with Top Secret midges. I also tie mine in a weird way, so maybe that's the problem. But yeah, they're in there. They don't get fished super often, but every now and then they have a use. And then we have the final 2 rows, which is dedicated to zebra midges. When you start fly tying, very likely the first fly that you're going to tie will be a zebra midge because it's easy, it's straightforward. It only really has one material, which is wire. So you have thread on a hook, and then you have wire, and that's it. That's the zebra midge. And it's made to imitate a midge larva. You ever look at midge larvae? They're like little teeny tiny black worms, and I mean really small. Flip over a couple rocks and look at them, and when you see those little black worms crawling around, those are midge larvae most likely. But these things just plain old work, right? You tie them on a curved nymph hook or a scud hook, and they just look great. They look like little worms. You segment them with small or ultra small wire. You can tie them with bead heads, which I think kind of makes it look like that sort of air bubble that midges get when they shoot up toward the surface. You can tie them unweighted and just let them trail along behind those big old porterhouse steak flies. However you fish them, they just plain work, guys. They work in black, they work in purple, they work in red. They just work, and they work all over the place. So much so that I almost always have a zebra midge somewhere in my rig over the course of the wintertime. It might get rotated out here or there, but I spend a lot of time with zebra midges on my line. And that's not an accident. They do fish really well. So everybody else is fishing zebra midges. The fish have seen 27 million variations of them. For some reason, they still eat them. So don't rule out those zebra midges. Now, remember, you can fish them real small. I mean, I have size 18s in here. That's about as big as I would ever get. And I have them all the way down to size 26s. If you want to know suffering, you need to tie size 26 flies. It will make your eyes go cross and water for like 2 days. It's crazy. But they do work. Small is good, especially when it comes to midges. And these get used pretty heavily in my box, which is why I have 2 full rows of them. And that's basically it. I mean, honorable mention, we do have something called the Lyson Ring Spider, which is basically a soft hackle fly. I don't use it very often in moving water. I will fish it pretty often twitched in still water, and it's very effective there. But that one I like enough that it's got 2 rows. And then we have the egg patterns, which are obviously meant to imitate eggs. They work okay around the spawning time. This is one of those flies that people swear to me is the best thing since sliced bread. Definitely have caught fish on egg patterns, but I just don't think they're anywhere near as amazing as people make them out to be. So even though I have a whole row of them, I don't know if I recall the last time that I tied on an egg pattern. So you decide what you want to do there. And then we have copper johns, which are almost as good as the Prince nymphs. These are real heavily weighted nymphs. They kind of look like mayfly nymphs. They've got like brown goose biot tails, and a flashback on them most of the time. But the defining characteristic for these flies is that they are wrapped really tightly with ultra wire. Could be small, could be extra small, whatever. They are designed to be super heavy. They're designed to sink quickly. So these are really good flies if you need to get your rig down fast and you don't want to use a Perdigon and you don't want to use split shot and whatever. A copper john is not a bad bet for you. And it works great in rivers. It also works really well in lakes. I've caught a lot of really good fish in still water using copper john patterns. And so if you haven't tried that before, you might want to give it a shot. They dangle down there and the fish sure think they look delicious. So, don't forget about your copper johns. And with that, that's basically it. I mean, there are a few sort of random patterns in there that are, my experimental row. I do have one row that's just for experimental flies that I've tied and want to see how they do. We don't need to get into those because most of them are a huge mess. And the truth is, they'll probably get eaten anyway because fly fishing is a lie. But you just don't need to concern yourself with my mad science experiments at the fly tying vise. But that's what's in my box, And as you can see, I mean, it's a pretty simple outfit. I mean, I carry the one box, as I said. I have a grand total of about 24 patterns in there, which is a lot. You probably don't need that. You could probably get away with half of that or a third of that even. But I like to be prepared just in case. They all get fished. Like I said, if they don't get fished, they're not in the box. You see me out on the river, chances are, well, number one, you're guaranteed I have this box with me. But number two, it's probably one of these patterns. There's not a lot of reason to switch. Every now and then I'll see a really good one and I got to have it. But if I'm being honest, that's just for my own fun. I just want to tie something new and not something necessarily that I have to do for the sake of the fishing. So that's my fly box in the wintertime. It's also my fly box for nymphs in the summertime and all the other seasons. So take that with a grain of salt. I don't really believe that you need to have seasonal boxes. But hey, fly fishing is a creative endeavor. If you want to do that, Via con Dios, Desperado. Go get it. But this is my deal. This is the box I've got with me. Catches me a bunch of fish in the winter. I hope it gives you some ideas of the flies that you can use. I really strongly encourage you to think about tying those flies yourself. Spend a little bit of money on a vise. Get yourself some instructional videos on YouTube. Get the materials at your local fly shop and just start tying, man. You're probably going to like it. And if you're not going to like it, it's okay. It doesn't have to be that expensive, and you can always just go buy your flies and leave your vise out so you still look sophisticated and cool when people come over to your house. But I really can't emphasize that enough. Get in there, tie your flies, fill up your own box with whatever patterns you want, play with them, modify them, experiment with them, figure out what you like, what you don't like, what meshes with your style and what doesn't, and have fun with it. Fly fishing is really not about the trout, like I've said before. It's about the bugs. I mean, that's the real love affair that we have going on here. You know, the bugs aren't doing their thing, fish aren't eating. And that means you get to sit around and be a weirdo. You know, you can talk mayflies and caddisflies and this species and that species and midges and everything else. It's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to be an uncontrolled dork when it comes to entomology and fly fishing. So with that, I will leave you alone. A couple quick notes here. Number one, this is the second to last episode of season 2. We have one more episode that features a really cool interview with Ron Belak about how to start planning for your spring adventures. So that'll be up next week on Friday. Then we're going to take a break. So I love you guys, but work is getting crazy for me, and I've got stuff that I've got to take care of. So now that we're wrapping up season 2, we're going to go away for, I hope, not longer than about a month or 5 weeks. But it's possible that it'll be closer to 6 weeks by the time I can get back into a groove and start producing content that is, I hope, worth you spending your time listening to. So keep that in mind. We've got one more episode, and then we're going to wrap up this season, and then we will be back with season 3, which will be all about spring fishing and starting to plan your trips into the backcountry as the snow starts to melt. If you have not already, I would love you to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever app you happen to use to listen. I did not want to ask for those explicitly because it feels weird, but I probably should. It does help. I think, it helps lend some legitimacy to the show and to the project. It feels good for me because I feel like maybe you're getting something out of this crazy podcast thing. And also, I they swear it doesn't, but I do think that it helps get this in front of people who will be able to use the information, which is really the point, right? The podcast isn't about me. It's about you guys. And my hope is that getting those reviews will really help drive it out there. And then beyond that, if you have questions or thoughts or comments, shoot me a note. I had somebody look me up on email the other day. That's okay if you really want to do it. But you can also send me a message on Facebook. You can go on there and check out our pictures. You can send me a message at the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast Instagram page, and I check that on a regular basis. But feel free to reach out to me if there's something you want to talk about, episode you want to hear, question you had, something I said that made you mad, whatever. Shoot me a note. I'm happy to hear from you. And I think starting next season, we might actually start talking about some of those questions on the podcast itself. So feel free to engage with me. I'm always happy to chat with you guys. I love hearing from you, and I love engaging with you. And with that, I think we can call it a day. So get out there, have fun, do a little bit of fishing, stay warm, be safe, and I'll see you real soon. Till next time, this is Ross. Maybe I'll see you out there. But I'm not giving you any of my flies.